Une telle remise en cause passe évidemment par un certain nombre de questionnements, entre autres le questionnement sur la politique, les politiques d'industrialisation mises en œuvre au niveau de notre continent. La problématique des politiques d'industrialisation en Afrique est l'objet de l'exposé que va nous présenter dans un instant le docteur Bruce Byers. Il est du Centre européen de développement. Bien que ce thème ne soit pas un thème particulièrement nouveau, il reste encore d'actualité au regard de nombreux problèmes de sous-emploi et des politiques d'industrialisation observées en Afrique. Dr Bruce Byers est PhD en économie de développement de l'Université de Sussex. Il dirige actuellement une équipe chargée de l'intégration régionale ainsi que du programme de transformation économique et agricole depuis 2011. Il s'intéresse beaucoup au processus d'intégration en Afrique. Il a beaucoup travaillé en Afrique du Sud, en Afrique de l'Est. Il a survolé l'Afrique centrale et a travaillé également au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. On espère qu'il viendra bientôt en Afrique centrale pour des raisons évidentes. Sans plus tarder, je vais lui donner la parole afin qu'il nous entretienne des politiques régionales d'industrialisation en Afrique.
First of all, I'd like to thank the AERC very much for the invitation to come and talk. It's an honor to be the first speaker at this seminar. And also, I'm quickly becoming aware that this is a senior policy seminar where I feel decidedly unsenior. So hopefully I'll manage to make up for it with the policy angle with the presentation I'm going to give. So I'm going to just talk about the political economy of regional industrial policies in Africa. Basically, as was presented by Professor Lema last year, there was the senior policy seminar was on industrialization. This year it's on regional integration, and what we see more and more is the two of these coming together. So just what I'm going to give you is actually the overview of a paper that we're working on at the moment. So it's in a way it's a work in progress. But I think many of the issues that I raise hopefully will be familiar. And actually, in some respects, it raises more questions than answers, but given the audience in the room, perhaps you will have some of the answers and some of the suggestions on what to do. So basically, I'm just going to provide a little bit why this is an important issue and why sort of the interest in this paper. A little bit what the context, or why is it we're talking about these things now? Why are we actually talking about regional industrial strategies now? And what does it mean? What are some of these opportunities and challenges? And then I'll try and say something at the end about what that means for policymakers and the kind of approaches that need to be taken. Oh, we have the magic, here we go. Okay, so just to give you a very brief introduction though, I'm from ECDPM, which is a terrible acronym, but it stands for the European Centre for Development Policy Management. Now this is a think tank set up in the 80s to inform and facilitate relations between Europe and Africa. So in fact, one of our sort of specific topics that we worked a lot on that many of you will be familiar with are the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements, which are kind of a prime target for understanding what are some of the challenges of linking Europe and Africa in commercial terms. What does it mean for moving from policy to practice? And at the moment, we have a large project which basically this work draws on the political economy dynamics of regional organizations. So trying to understand really where is it these organizations have traction, what are the member state interests of using regional organizations, and therefore what does that mean in terms of specific policy areas which have some potential for actually providing support and for taking the regional agenda forward. So I'm just going to quickly present sort of three quick starting points which very much help frame the kind of thinking that we have behind this work. I mean, the first comes from the Kagame report that most of you will be familiar with. Although it focused on the African Union and institutional reform of the African Union, it makes a number of very sort of lucid points about policy analysis, policy implementation, what actually needs to take place. And I think here basically highlights the importance of regional cooperation. So the distinctive feature of recent developments is that even the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nations cannot hope to deal with the changes alone. So there is a need underlying many of the issues that we're talking, whether it's peace and security, whether it's environmental climate change, and indeed talking about economic development, then these cannot be addressed alone. And to take another person coming from the AUC, ex-chairperson Dlamini Zuma, talking about what was taking place in Africa, said, "I don't think Africa is short of policies. We have to implement. That is where the problem is." And in a way, that's our second starting point. And the third starting point, this is actually a quote, comes from an academic on regional integration called Frederick Soderbaum, says that regionalism can solve a variety of collective action dilemmas is indisputable. So the regionalism and regional approaches, the logic is there, but it is equally clear that it may sometimes be exploitative, reinforce asymmetric power relations, or lead to a range of detrimental outcomes. So I think the starting point then is that there are winners and losers. I think that's very clear even just looking at sort of economic theory and looking at trade theory. But these things need to be taken into account if we're talking about implementation and if we're talking about regional cooperation more broadly. So the starting hypothesis for this work of looking at regional integration, regional industrialization strategies then sort of builds on these starting points. And also on prior work then that we did looking at 5 of the different RECs, the regional economic communities, and sort of the main sort of findings that came from that were that political interests affect implementation outcomes. So when Dlamini Zuma is talking about the lack of implementation, what we're saying is it's not just political will, it's an issue of political interest. What's driving what takes place is to do with interest within the country. The next one is that institutional form doesn't necessarily mean institutional function. So the fact of, to take a very sort of general example, having an anti-corruption commission doesn't mean that it's playing the role of an anti-corruption commission or that it's actually dealing with corruption. So similarly at a regional level, having a regional court or having a regional strategy is sort of the form, it's there, and what we're talking about is how can you get it to play its actual function. And earlier we had some already mention of the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, where the words that were used by the Prime Minister of Uganda were, if implemented effectively, could have important implications for development and growth. And I think this is where we really want to dig in to say, just because you have the agreement doesn't mean we have implementation. The implementation itself then, from the work that we did in past regional integration processes, we talked about the influence of swing states, so the likes of sort of Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, in terms of influencing what happens at regional level. Private sector demand, it was already mentioned that we need to engage the private sector more. Finance is important, and in fact, one of the key reasons that we as ECDPM have ended up doing this work is because of the international partners are those who actually underpin much of the finance of most of the regional organizations. So there's a question that arises with them saying, we're providing this finance, but we don't understand how these regional organizations work. So what is it that actually make these things tick? So, and of course, there's also historical trends that were mentioned and sort of wider external factors. So also the Prime Minister mentioned the fact the changing nature of trade, Brexit, these kind of things have some kind of influence on the way that countries see and try to or seek their objectives through regional integration. So the 3 questions then that we're trying to address with this paper is basically, what do the regional industrialization strategies actually aim to achieve? And what I'm going to show is that sort of from a national perspective, what's very often happened is that the national perspective has simply been scaled up to a regional perspective, but actually the implications of what that means in practice are quite different. So then, how do the political economy dynamics within and between countries then shape what takes place? And what are the implications for policymakers? So that's sort of a bit oh, we have people trying to come in. Okay, so just to give a bit sort of on the industrial strategies and why now. I mean, most people working on this topic will be familiar with the fact that industrial policy was something of a taboo until maybe sort of 10, 15 years ago. So just looking at industrial policy in general, there is this growing sense that there is a need for industrial policy, for economic transformation. There's a fear that Africa is deindustrializing. Sorry, excuse me. And there's a question mark there. I mean, I think deindustrializing Africa, figures suggest that as a share, sub-Saharan Africa is producing a lower manufacturing output than previously, but as a share, but in real terms, it is still increasing. But nonetheless, the share of manufacturing value added is still lower than in the 1970s. So there's basically a sense that there's Africa being left behind in terms of manufacturing share within the economies. We also have the end of the commodity supercycle, which means that much of the high growth rates that we were seeing over the last 10, 15 years are coming to an end. demographic growth is still enormous, requiring sort of at least 11 million jobs per annum. So between that and this sort of combination of an understanding of the manufacturing sector and the industrial sector and the role it can play, basically there's a growing agreement over the last 5-10 years then that getting prices right is not enough. The sort of drawing on the East Asian example, then there is now a need for policies which actively promote economic transformation. And when we're talking about economic transformation, then we're talking about the need to promote productivity or policies to boost productivity within sectors. So it's sort of to a degree about technology, but also other factors that affect what takes place within sectors. But it's also about trying to move people from low productivity sectors to high productivity sectors. And I think one of the key texts on this then comes from Hausman, Roderick and Sabel, which is about trying to understand what industrial policy then should be doing. So if we talk about normalizing, or they talk about normalizing industrial policy, then they talk about this is a set of collaborative policies and procedures for detecting and responding to distortions in the economy. So already the policy objective actually of industrial policy is now sort of considered much more a process, something which is sort of a collaborative set of dialogue plus interventions plus monitoring plus responses. So something which is very iterative and adaptive rather than something which is very selective and targeted. So in their paper, though, they talk to 3 specific market failures that industrial policy needs to address. The first of these then is public inputs failure, where the point is that with limited ex-ante knowledge from the government or the public sector side on what some of the specific problems and challenges are within the industrial sector, then public inputs are provided sort of suboptimally. So basically there's a need to try and better understand where the challenges are in the private sector, to therefore provide targeted public inputs, infrastructures, sort of wider policy reforms for standards and quality assurance. And basically that these then need to be able to there needs to be an information failure overcome in order to know how to apply these, which then comes through this set of collaborative discussions. The second key market failure then are coordination failures, which so they're based on the understanding that for certain investments to take place require other accompanying investments to make this commercially viable. So in order for one investment to take place, one of the examples that comes to mind actually comes from here in the region in Tanzania with the SAG corridor, which essentially was pushed by a fertilizer company which was seeking to try and boost the fertilizer market, but that required then more investment in working with smallholder farmers. It required post-harvest storage. It required better infrastructure to improve linkages with markets. So in a way, everything needed to take place at the same time in order for this market for fertilizer to actually be worthwhile, this investment in fertilizer to be worthwhile. So this is kind of one of this coordination failure then that they see as industrial policy needs to try and address, to see what are the accompanying investments that need to take place. And then the third one is at a much more micro level, saying, well, within that then it's about specific firms. Firms need to be able to understand what can be produced profitably in the specific conditions that they're in. And an industrial policy then working through government needs to sort of aim at trying to help these firms offset the risks that are taken to understand what can be done profitably. So it's also about helping firms capture the positive externalities, the first mover returns, without those being immediately taken up by others. So overall then, sort of the point that we focus on here then is this is about process. It's about consultation, learning, feedback loops, dialogue, and it's about sort of iterative adaptation. And this is just talking nationally. Now, the way it's presented is sort of you set up these processes and then this becomes something where everybody is obviously interested in industrial policy, so this begins to have traction. But then there's an additional strand of work looking at the political economy of industrial policy, trying to understand what is it that makes industrial policy work when it happens, and looking at different African economies. And I think then this quote then becomes key to understanding sort of what takes place in which countries. Politics are central to understanding why governments pursue industrial policies, which sectors they target, and with what kind of policies, and especially this last bit, and how these policies are actually implemented. And this publication by Whitfield et al. Then has a number of case studies pointing out where it is that sort of national political incentives, so they give the example in Mozambique of sugar, for example, where they managed, despite very low sort of capacity within government, managed to set up an autonomous sugar institute, which managed to work with the private sector, with protective surcharges on sugar imports, with sugar investors to basically all work together in areas which were politically sensitive for the ruling party. So the point was that sort of in central Mozambique and in areas where there had been sugar production prior to the Civil War, there was a political incentive to encourage investment and ensure that there was employment creation within these zones. So this is the kind of the insight then that comes from, it's not just about those processes, it's also about understanding political interest. And what they point to then is the need for there to be mutual interest among the state bureaucrats, so those implementing the policies, firms are basically the private sector, firms and farms, and ruling elites, so those who are in sort of the situations of power within the political parties, who basically decide what takes place, when and how. And this needs still nonetheless to be linked to bureaucratic efficiency. There needs to be capacity, and that's where sort of in the sugar example I'm talking about, they talk about an autonomous unit set up. And there needs to be ways of learning for productivity. So this goes back then, that's the link in a way back to what I was talking about from the Hausman approach. So all that then raises a number of challenges for industrial policy in general, and in a way already suggests there's a need for realism when thinking about this, that this is going to be not a very kind of straightforward linear path, but something that's going to have to be quite iterative and adaptive. And as we know then, working regionally then adds an entirely new level of complication, or new level of complexity. So up until recently then we could say, well, why is there this sudden surge now in regional and industrial policy? And on one hand you can say, well, it's basically the same logic. So the fact that we have these underperforming, or a sense of underperforming industrial sectors, the fact that there is this need for job creation, all point to the fact that indeed you should have a regional industrialization strategy. If all the countries are pushing for industrialization, then it makes sense to have a regional strategy. And in a way, all you're doing is looking at the same issues on a larger scale, and the underlying principles of regional integration still stand. We're talking about economies of scale, fragmented markets that need to be linked together to encourage investment, which can get the economies of scale, which make it worthwhile to take that investment. The emphasis on regional industrial policy, though, beyond those two aspects, has also come to something of a frustration with the trade integration agenda. And if you look, for example, at SADC, even explicitly in the SADC industrialization strategy, it talks about frustration with progress from the FTA. It talks about a sense that countries are less and less willing to open up markets until they feel they have built up an industrial base. And indeed, the SADC industrialization strategy was pushed by Zimbabwe initially, and it can be understood, therefore, as a response to the more traditional trade liberalization agenda. Came the sort of regional industrial strategy to try and offset what might be some of the losses, and also to have more of a kind of a supply side response. So in order to benefit from this market access, talking about regional strategies, therefore, to boost the supply capacity. And then finally, one of the other sort of logics that's used to talk about why we needed regional industrial policy is there's a sense in global value chains now are the way that trade is taking place. We have trade in tasks, and there's a sense that instead of only supplying primary raw materials into global value chains, that regional value chains can provide a potential entry point, a potential sort of learning point where the barriers to entry aren't so high, and therefore they can provide a stepping stone to operating within global value chains. Now, I've sort of said, so why now? But the point I think that was also made before is that it's not that regional industrialization is a new thing. So this already in the 70s, there was a whole swathe of, starting already with ECOWAS, talking about the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, the Abuja Treaty, which came into force in 1994, as was mentioned this morning. All of these actually talk about cooperation in the field of industrial development. They talk about collective industrialization, but very much kind of as an ideology. So this was also sort of during the period before structural adjustment in many cases, where this was still a sense of sort of collective industrial policy to try and protect the region against the outer world. But this more recent wave then has come through, at the AU level, accelerated industrial development for Africa. So we have a continental plan for industrialization. Then we begin to have some of the RECs as from 2010. The WASIP, the West Africa Common Industrial Policy, the EAC Industrialization Policy 2012. SADC, in a way, has gone the furthest, and what becomes interesting as you go through these, they've got the Industrial Development Policy Framework, followed by the Roadmap, followed by the Action Plan. Now, on one hand, these can be seen as a lot of good work for consultants who keep coming back. Is that still working? Who keep coming back to the same issue and going a little bit further. But what is actually interesting, you can see that the reason that SADC has this is because it's very difficult to move beyond very broad regional statements. So the action plan finally tries to push to something which is a lot more concrete, but as I'll discuss in a minute, that still sort of is something as a challenge. And then so just to show that sort of all the main RECs have their industrialization policies, and they're all in sort of in recent versions. So this is something which is certainly high on the agendas. It's part of the rhetoric, but one of the big challenges then is how to actually put them into practice. So just to go back then to what I was discussing in terms of the Hausman and Roderick approach, if sort of the role for government to address those three market failures, one of the questions is, can we just turn this around then? Can we just say, actually, regional organizations can assist the industrial sector through the provision of inputs, legislation, etc. Regional organizations can help coordinate complementary investments. Regional organizations can help by offsetting the risk to entrepreneurs. It's one of these big questions then, because the logic of the regional strategies is often that the objectives are just a scaled up version of national objectives about raising the share of manufacturing value added in GDP. But in fact, do regional organizations actually play this same role of providing inputs, coordinating? Or does it actually imply different objectives and approaches? So this is us getting back then to the initial questions that I set up. So just to take them one by one then, if we look at the regional objectives, what becomes quite striking when you read if we look at ECOWAS, SADC, COMESA and the EAC, essentially the objectives are laid out as you would expect for a national economy. So it talks about doubling the share of manufacturing value added in the region's GDP. So already kind of assuming that this regional economy is one. Increase manufactured exports of total SADC exports, build SADC's market share, lift the regional growth rate of real GDP from 4% to a minimum of 7%. So already the objectives that are being presented are extremely sort of macro scaled up with very little attention paid to the heterogeneity which is going on within these different regions. So if we just take SADC and the 16 members of SADC, I mean, it's not particularly new to note that South Africa has 60% of the regional GDP, and I think the bit that's missing under here is there's something like 2 million inhabitants. Between Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland, Seychelles and Mauritius, you basically have less than 2 million inhabitants. So between those 6 countries, less than 2 million inhabitants. So the industrial needs and the industrial interests are going to be completely different, of course. So if we're talking about these wide objectives of raising the manufacturing value added, then it begins to raise questions about, well, if this is all going to take place in South Africa, is that something which is it still fits in? You can actually still raise the manufacturing value added of the region by having it all in one country. So obviously that's not what politically is seen as acceptable. And the same just goes for COMESA. If you look at sort of the spread of the region, to talk about a common regional industrial policy for all these countries, then we begin to see that those objectives then are something which is which needs to be broken down slightly further. So this is actually recognized in many of in the strategies. So they actually do talk about the need to be equitable, and it's highlighted basically by past experience. So as we showed, there's been industrial policies around at the regional level since at least the 70s, and actually what you see is that they've been very weak in implementation. Examples come from the SACU industrial policy experience, where South Africa was basically perceived to have taken up all the benefits when they were identifying regional value chains to promote. Even the case in the EAC, where although now perhaps this is less the case, the first EAC we know that it collapsed largely to do with, or in large part to do with a perceived perception that Kenya was the only one benefiting. And here in SADC, we know that South Africa is already very much sort of in the wider region. So the largest destination for South African manufactured exports is the rest of Africa. So it's overtaken the EU as of 2010. So even without the CFTA and without the SADC industrialization strategy being put in place, South African exports to the region are already shooting up. Yet we're still talking about multinational investment projects. So we're talking about boosting the overall manufacturing value added and doing this across countries. But I think so basically the point within this sort of element of what objectives are which, I think that our analysis then of looking at what's taking place within the regions and what interests are actually playing out begins to show that national interests basically trump any regional interests or regional strategies. And I think if we look in the EAC, what we understand, just looking at recent pipeline politics between Uganda, whether it's going to use the pipeline through Kenya or Tanzania. If you look at recent trade wars, where Tanzania was refusing imports of dairy and other products, sort of cement, and then sort of based on Kenya refusing the gas imports from Tanzania, basically we can see that the national politics are essentially setting up, are part of the trigger for these trade barriers, which, regardless of this regional objective of boosting manufacturing, are basically triggering the real implementation. I think if you look at in other regions in Nigeria, the import ban list of, I think it's something like 41 products, includes a whole range of products which are actually part of the priority list at the regional level. So basically what we're looking at is that national interests are trumping regional interests, but also this is somewhat legitimate. So the point is that within each of these economies, there are specific challenges that need to be addressed. And just to take the case of South Africa, although dominant in the region, if we look just at sort of productivity growth, this is over the last 10 years, or sorry, 93 to 2013, employment growth and productivity growth, what you see is that the sectors that had most employment growth are not the ones with the highest productivity. So if we're talking about promoting economic transformation, then just looking at a national level, then we see that the sectors that have the highest productivity are the ones with the lowest employment growth. So if this is the case, and if South Africa is dealing with this at their own political and policy level, the big question is, does working at a regional level somehow boost their employment or boost their productivity? And I think one of the challenges then is to see precisely how that can happen through this regional industrial policy. So that's just in terms of the objectives. The second, well, sort of the first of the three elements then of the Hausman framework was looking at regional public goods. And this is where it becomes interesting because, in fact, what Hausman, etc., talk about in terms of regional public goods is actually very much the existing regional integration agenda. It's about providing cross-cutting infrastructure. It's providing sort of relatively neutral interventions at a regional level. It's about applying the EAC strategy. Talks about the need actually to use the common external tariff in order for the industrial policy to work. The need to get rid of non-tariff barriers. The COMESA talks about enablers, which actually end up being the same issues that are talked about in regional integration agenda in general. And SADC also talks about sort of transport and infrastructure and power pools and things. So in a way, the missing public goods aspect of industrial policy is essentially the wider regional integration agenda. And basically sort of shows, on one hand, how this is not a new agenda in some respects once we take it down to this providing inputs, but it does also then raise not just the issue then of country interests, which we talked about before, but also how then do you link this to other policy areas. And just to show, maybe even if you can't read this, it's almost not important, but the main point is that within the SADC Industrialization Action Plan, it talks about the need to take into account these 13 other different regional strategies. So the point is sort of providing these regional public goods is fine, but actually this becomes much more an issue of how to manage that internally and organizationally. And then also, sorry, there was a change in, so how do we organize that organizationally? Within regional organizations, of infrastructure and industry are basically considered separate. Industry is generally one directorate, one small directorate, sometimes linked to trade, but sometimes just sitting apart. So there are proposals then to set up these sort of bureaucratic islands of effectiveness with sectoral councils, or in the SADC case, they're talking about trying to change the setup to have an industrial development and trade directorate rather than mixing it all together. But essentially it becomes this organizational issue, and it becomes an issue of the role of industrial policy. If industrial policy is now the new overarching regional strategy and everything works towards that, then you can begin to understand there might be some traction. But if actually, if we're looking at the SADC type role where it's just one among 13 different policy areas, and you can see where even with the logic and with the political discourse, that this then gets lost once we start talking here. And this table was just actually to show another aspect of this this table comes from the EAC's industrialization strategy. And all the pluses are where the countries have those policy interventions already in their national strategy. So this is basically also just to raise the issue of what is the regional strategy actually doing? Is it just substituting or complementing what's taking place at the regional level? Which then pushes us then to understand better the aspect of the place of industrial policy. The second area then was the regional coordination failures, which were about public and private coordination. So this was about sort of coordinating investments. And I think this is another one where at least the rhetoric is very clear on the need for private sector dialogue mechanisms with the East Africa Business Council, the COMESA Business Council, SADC has the Southern Africa Business Forum. What they also do within these strategies is actually trying to look at this coordination aspect through regional value chains as part of the sort of the intervention strategy. So in a way saying, okay, so let's, even if we leave this public inputs aspect on the side in terms of the cross-cutting things, and look more targeted at trying to coordinate investments, then regional value chains then becomes the sort of the interesting part, and efforts are sort of being made or to talk at least about sort of setting up business networks and things. But here again, then we have this question of these, how are they doing that? Well, it comes through priority sectors. Almost all of the regional strategies have the same priority sectors: agro-processing, mineral beneficiation, pharmaceuticals, and then there's a sort of a little bit of variation for other ones. But these are basically the same as the national priorities. So if we were previously saying that the overall objective of promoting manufacturing value added then is taken at a national level, but it faces these country interests, then in fact, even at the sectoral level, we already face the same way, just the same challenge, precisely because of the way that the policies were made. So if you're going to choose regional priority sectors, and you use the same ones that all the countries are prioritizing at a national level, you're going to come up against these kind of issues of competition. And in fact, sort of the pharmaceutical sector is a good one, looking at ECOWAS, where Nigeria has essentially banned imports of pharmaceuticals, while the Francophone countries are very much reliant on pharmaceuticals coming from France. So in fact, you have these other dynamics within each of these priority sectors, which also then has a big influence of what takes place. And then there's a big sort of question. We've said private sector needs to be involved. Private sector are the ones that actually put industrial policies in practice. But in reality, where is the demand? Regional business associations exist, but there's often, the work that we've done sort of suggests that they have sort of reasonably limited traction in a way in terms of influencing what takes place. And even within specific organizations, there are questions about representation. For example, in the Southern Africa Business Forum, there's a sense that it's overrepresented of South African interests again. So again, coming back to these, trying to overcome these coordination failures, there is a role then for regional strategies, but it becomes very much about trying to understand where that can take place given the sort of political economy dynamics of the specific sectoral areas. And in a way, one of the things that the outcomes of this has been that regional strategies have become about aligning policies rather than investments. So there's a kind of sense as you read through the regional strategies that actually this is all about aligning these things together rather than actually promoting investment as such. And just to give an example, here are the EAC priority sectors, where iron ore and other mineral processing are a regional priority sector that's been agreed, that's within the EAC regional strategy, but where Uganda has an export ban on iron ore because it's trying to set up its own iron ore processing plant. Similarly, petrochemicals and gas, the recent trade war between Kenya and Tanzania was around Tanzanian gas imports to Kenya. In agro-processing, the dairy story between Kenya and the links between the key dairy players in the Kenyan political level also then play out at what takes place within the regional level. And then, I just put this at the end, the Mitumba ban itself also begins to raise a lot of issues about for once there's an apparent agreement at a regional level to ban second-hand imports as a way to promote industrialization regionally, so it almost seems sort of the case of where something might happen, but then Kenya becomes worried about its AGOA access and the threats from the US, so then sort of pulls back from this ban. So it's again sort of just raising this issue about national interest, but also sort of the role of this regional policy. What is the regional role then? Is it about actually just doing the same thing that's being selected nationally, or should it be about complementing? And I think the point is that basically, if it's doing the same thing or the same priority sectors, then the potential for traction and actual implementation are very low. So I think that's basically saying the same thing. And then the final point was about self-discovery. So it's about trying to help firms understand where there is a commercial viability in terms of investment. And the point is that, that this is expensive, that it leads to underinvestment, that it requires an understanding of obstacles. And within each of the regional industrialization strategies, there is a sense, or there is a reference to the need to promote SMEs, to promote clusters. Within the EAC policy, for example, there's discussion of incentives for startup industries and measures to protect infant industries. But again, up till now, this has had very little in the way of implementation. And one of the good examples where something has taken place is under COMESA. So even though we saw COMESA as trying to promote industrial policy for this huge, diverse region, then some of the success stories then have been in specific cluster approaches. So we can talk about the Leather and Leather Products Institute, which was set up, where member states can apply to be a part of this initiative. We have, I think there's 3 or 4 states that are involved, which leads to COMESA providing support to national leather industries. And so, in a way, they did this in leather. They also tried in cotton and cassava, but leather is the one which has had most success. So then there's also a kind of question about, well, is this because of the leather value chain specifically that has implications or something else? But what's interesting in this one, and the kind of the key question that's missing here then is that regional? Is providing learning and skills development at a national level in leather in Zambia, does that count as a regional, do we need a regional industrial approach to be able to do that? So in a way, the biggest success that we can point to is something which hasn't been regional, but has been provided by a regional organization, but it's not regional in nature. It's actually, it's very value chain and country specific in nature. So just sort of getting towards the end then, I mean, this quote then comes from the SADC strategy, where it makes it very clear that having been through their 3 different steps of strategy, policy, and action plan, that the real challenge is for corporate and government policymakers to identify and prioritize entry points into value chains. So we've identified the value chains, but now what do? What should SADC be doing to try and promote these sort of additional investments which should take place, to have the benefits shared within these regional value chains? So we're back again to the whole challenge is how to get shared benefits from these regional approaches. So that's a very sort of brief overview then of the different industrial strategies that are there, the main objectives that they seek to address, and coming back each time to some of the challenges basically which the regional organizations then need to address. So in terms of trying to, I don't know if there's anyone from any of the RECs, is there anyone from any of the RECs in the room actually? From any of the regional organizations? No? Okay. So high levels, we're high level without the regional organizations. So it would have been interesting to get a response from them. But I think one of the challenges then is saying, well, if this regional industrial policy depends on country politics, then we can maintain the objective, but the ambitions and the scope need to be drastically reduced. Even one of I think it was the Prime Minister this morning mentioned the fact that the agenda is extremely wide. And even within industrial strategies, it remains extremely wide. And the wider it is, the harder it is to actually to find specific common interests and ability to actually put things in traction. So they need to sort of revise the ambitions and scope and be much more narrow. And in fact, in terms of these objectives, it's fine to have these wide objectives about the manufacturing value added at a regional level. But I think now what you begin to see is the need to actually zoom in on specific value chains. So the coordination aspect then is necessary. But because we're talking about within country interests and between country interests, then it's very difficult. And the analysis of any of the successes that we've seen is that these need to build on political interest. Private sector consultation is also important. I think I maybe skipped over in West Africa. One of 10 programs which had success was also the SQAM, the Standards, Quality Assurance and Metrology program, precisely because it built on private sector interests about sort of engaging in cross-border trade where standards were necessary in sort of 41 different sectors. So the point is that it's about investment, not just policy coordination, which then takes us back to public inputs and the need to think of the wider regional agenda. If those can be targeted towards industrialization, then that might already help actually bring some of the targeting that I'm saying is needed. And then in terms of the support to self-discovery, I think the example from COMESA shows that you can have political traction within specific areas, and then it becomes just a question of what does that mean in terms of taking things to a regional level. So just to finish then, if we're talking about within country politics, we go back to, it is about the process of identifying problems, experimenting and learning, but this then at a regional level. So the regional organization almost needs to take on a new role, which then means it's about building these pockets of capacity within the regional organization with a degree of sort of bureaucratic autonomy, which may need reconfiguration of how regional secretariats work. There needs to be some sort of genuine private sector interest. The starting point for all this, in a way, needs to be under a better understanding of where specific private sector challenges are faced in terms of cross-border value chains. And then just at the end, we have this ABC, which in a way is to try and remember more generally in terms of the policy, if we begin to try and bring it back to politics, is that ambitions need to be revised, brokerage between actors is key, and there's a need for working with coalitions. So this is about essentially finding those who are genuinely interested in seeing progress take place, whether from the private and public sector, and managing to work in a concentrated way, even if we're talking at a regional level. So that was a very quick overview, but I hope I managed to do justice to the topic. Thank you very much.
À une autopsie des politiques d'industrialisation nationale et nationale sur notre continent. Je voudrais rassurer le docteur Bayes que le diagnostic fait, la plupart des problèmes identifiés au niveau national, en Afrique australe, Afrique orientale et Afrique occidentale, se retrouvent également en Afrique centrale, bien qu'il n'en ait pas parlé, ce qui veut dire que les recommandations que nous allons formuler pourront bien s'appliquer aussi à cette partie de notre continent. Maintenant, avec votre permission, je voudrais passer la parole à Dr Adam Mungume. C'est le discussant du jour. Il est directeur exécutif de la recherche et des politiques à la Banque centrale de l'Ouganda. Je ne suis pas du FBI, mais d'après mes informations, c'est l'un des meilleurs économistes du pays. Alors, nous allons l'écouter pour ces commentaires sur ce papier que nous a présenté le docteur Bayes. Docteur, vous avez la parole.
Can I speak from here?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. And also, once we acknowledge that industrial policy is relevant for industrialization, given that we have the market, then really that's what the starting point for the paper. Now, the two aspects, incidentally, are not new to Africa. At independence, we all know we started with the regional integration aspect. Actually, in the case of East African Community, our first East African Community was 1967 and it lasted until 1977. And actually, the quarrel between why it ended up breaking up was simply because industries were in Kenya and in other countries there were no industries. It goes back to what the presenter was talking about, the national vis-a-vis the regional aspect. What about industrialization policies? We have also gone through this high protective walls. We have, import restrictions. We have all done all that, gone through all that. Have we learned from our failures? Probably that's the question mark. Really have African countries learned from our failures? Or it is a question of saying, if you try once, you try again. If you try once and fail, try again. But also it is insanity to do the same thing expecting the different results at the end of the day. So I think the presenter was a bit lenient on that, coming out clear that actually we have done through some of the aspects of regional integration and industrialization policy in Africa. And I think the end result was what I think he mentioned also, the famous 3 Ps. You have policies, you have programs, you have projects, but implementation is lacking. Probably to bring it into the context in the Ugandan case. In the case, for example, in the terms of the PPs, Uganda is one of the countries with the best laws of anti-corruption. Actually, in the ranking, I think we score 99 out of 100 in terms of anti-corruption laws. But we also know that we are the most corrupt guys. So again, the question is, you have the policies, you have the programs, but implementation is a bit of a challenge. Another case from Ugandan case is we have the best budgetary framework, if not on African continent. Our budgeting process, our annual budgeting process is really one of the best. Once we look at our budget every year, the budget framework papers, etc., they are the best you can really read and appreciate. But when it comes to implementation, the answer is, if it is ranking from 0 to 100, probably will be in the lower category. Indeed, if you look at the index by World Bank of, the famous worldwide indicator of governance, in East African community, apart from Rwanda, we have all, in terms of effective government, we have all ranked in the range of 0 to 30. Remember that the maximum is 100, but most of our countries are between 0 and 30 since 1990s. So the question is, so given that context, therefore, whatever we propose that looks really very good in terms of regional integration and industrialization has to bring into the aspect, can we really do the implementation? I think really that's where, if we are to help African countries, ourselves, really that is really where we have to emphasize. In other words, how can we build the state capacity to ensure that whatever we put on the paper, really we implement? Now, I have had an opportunity to participate in regional integration negotiations. This is a COMESA. Now we have been in Kigali negotiating for African, the whole entire African tax tariffs. The heads of state are going to sign it in July. We already have a common market in East Africa, and the question is, have we managed to even implement what we talk about in terms of common market, even for East African community? Worryingly, that's really where there is a bit of a challenge. So, much as I think, as also the presenter highlighted, much as we bring the aspect that where regional integration is beneficial, we have the policies, we can even identify some of the bottlenecks at the country level. We want to scale up. We want value chains for the blocks. The question is really, it is really a question of having this being implemented. Now, I think one other aspect is, can regional integration, for example, fail in Africa? If we remain the way we are, for example, I talked about the quarrel between Kenya and Tanzania. We are under one common market. So the question is, if you are still quarreling between the milk from Kenya to Tanzania, Kenya quarreling about wheat flour from Tanzania to Kenya, you remember you are under one common market. The question is, how can you really have the integration that is meaningful in terms of driving industrialization? And I think really that's where the bureaucratic or the governance issue comes on board. Indeed, for example, in the case of Uganda and Kenya, when you used to have a lot of non-tariff barriers, it would take, say, 21 days, say, from getting a container from Mombasa to Kampala. But the day the president of Kenya said, remove all roadblocks overnight, now that 21 days came to around less than 5 days. So one word from the president alone made sure that the non-tariff barriers were all eased the flow of goods from the port of Mombasa to Kampala within a week compared to what it used to be in terms of 21 days. So which automatically tells us what? That the political leadership matters in all these things we are talking about. Once we have a leader that sees what we are talking about, is a driver, then you are likely to have a bit of success. The question is, again, once you have a leader who has to convince 6 or 10 or 20 leaders, really whether that one, how it becomes effective is another big bit of challenge. So overall, I think if we remain in the current situation where we have, for example, let me, again, I know it is a crime to talk about it, under East African community, you have a situation where Burundi and Rwanda can't talk. I know it is a sacrilege to mention it, but it's a question of you belong to one community, but two countries cannot really talk. Actually, the even flow of goods from one country to the other is restricted. The question is, if you have that kind of arrangement and you belong to regional integration, even if you're talking about value chains, etc., I think to see really there's a bit of a challenge. So I think what I'm underscoring here is the role of the political leadership, and I think also that's what the President highlighted. It becomes really crucial in driving the agenda of this regional integration aspect. We cannot talk about value chains even from country to the regional level unless our leaders are really sold to these aspects. I think one aspect related to that also is a question of what we are seeing in East Africa community now is what we call tax competition. One country is offering tax holidays, so they are competing to each one to offer tax holidays to attract investors. Yet, we formed the regional integration to enlarge the market. Here we are fighting again to attract investors in each of our countries without necessarily looking at the regional aspect. So in that case, where does regional integration come in terms of some of these aspects we are talking about? You see, in Uganda we had something called the Buy Uganda, Build Uganda. The only person, it went up to cabinet level, it passed. We wrote regulations to implement it. But what Buy Uganda, Build Uganda says is that if it is the procurement in Uganda, they would give around 30% priority to indigenous Ugandans. Initially, it was indigenous Ugandans. So the first person who opposed it and stood alone was the Governor Bank of Uganda, and he wrote it, and he was really not, everybody was blaming him being anti-Uganda. His question was, if we are under East African community, what does Buy Uganda, Build Uganda mean? Mainly so, if you are saying it is only a Ugandan who can supply particular percentage to any procurement in the government enterprise. It went past the cabinet level regulations. It is only in December, last year, when the investors now had to approach the president and say, Mr. President, what does this thing, we are investors in Uganda, why are we being discriminated? It is when the president said that is not, should not be acceptable. Each farm in Uganda, whether owned by a Ugandan or owned by an East African, it must be taken as an indigenous farm. Secondly, I think that was a question of saying, that's what again what I'm saying in terms of political leadership. Because to the extent that it had gone up to the cabinet level, it had passed. Private sector was actually, had supported it. Some of the private sector people had also supported it. The question, by the time you are writing regulation and saying that 30% of the procurement must be supplied by a Ugandan, and so what does a Ugandan mean? It must be a farm owned by more than 51% by a Ugandan. So that was really discriminatory. Yet, we belong to the same East African community. We also belong to COMESA. We are talking about the African Union. So you see that really, it was really a bit of inconsistent until the president himself went in and said, no, all farms that are in Uganda must be treated as Ugandans irrespective of the ownership. It goes back to what I was emphasizing about the leadership. So overall, some of these aspects of regional integration and industrialization go back to really what type of leaders, at the end of the day, to drive through the agenda. As I said, industrialization is looking from Eastern Asian type is a welcome aspect. And we have already said that without industrialization policy, I think most of our countries will not do industrialization. And I think the whole argument about industrialization is that industries provide better jobs than agriculture, for example. That's really the argument. It is the same argument at the time of independence, that once you have industries produce, and therefore they are more productive than, say, smallholder agricultural systems, and therefore they are likely to employ more people and also pay better wages. Now, that is really, do we see in history where countries have used that and have succeeded? Obviously, the answer is yes. So, indeed, that's why in most of our countries now, we are really trying to revive the industrialization policies, knowing that China, South Korea, etc., really used that, and therefore in the process they had industrialization. But again, as I said, the question comes, what type of industrialization are we talking about? Is it general? Is it specific? Is it selective? Do we look at particular per country, for example? I think probably that's where also the presenter's discussion never came out very well. Do we, for example, look at country by country and say, okay, Uganda, you can easily industrialize, say, starting from agricultural processing. Kenya, you can industrialize probably starting from a particular another aspect. And therefore, in the process, then we have, industrialization strategy. The challenge we have now is we all want to make cars. Uganda started having a program to make a car, electric car, led by Makerere University. We succeeded making one. I don't know whether it's still moving or whether it got stuck in the road. That's a difference. Now, on the side, Rwanda and Kenya came on board. Rwanda has already attracted a company to assemble some type of cars. Kenya the same. Now, looking at, okay, I have said that we have a market of 170 East Africans. The question is whether out of these we can have the ability to buy the cars made in Kenya and the cars made in Rwanda. Uganda, incidentally, although we are the one who started the idea of electric cars and the bus etc., as I said, we are good in policies, but nothing implemented. So we fall off from the ladder. So it is now Rwanda and Kenya that are driving the process. The same story we started with trying to assemble laptops. In the case of Uganda, we had a program, I think, at one time we wanted to make laptops. It fell through the cracks, lucky enough or unlucky, but Rwanda is already making them. The question is, once you make these laptops, are they, I know we belong to East African community, etc., but you are competing with the rest of the world. Is that really where the selective industrialization should be best? Or I know in the literature we say we can make comparative advantages by ourselves. But the question is, do you start from the car or do you start making sure that actually you can fix the potholes in the road? I think really that's where the question is. Do you start making a killer bus that is electric, or you can start first making sure that actually you don't have potholes in the road? You have the technology to fix the potholes. I think really that's where sometimes our policies get mixed up. We are in everything. We want to make cars, we want to make laptops, we want to make bicycles, we want to fly to the moon, but yet at the same time, even in our backyard, we have potholes. So the question is really having the selective mind in terms of arranging and say, okay, I think this is what can work and what may not necessarily work. Now, out of this discussion, do we have a room really where we can have focused and meaningful intervention as in terms of policy? The answer is yes, but we have to have clear minds and clear goals, not short term, but probably longer time span, knowing really what we want to aim what we are aiming at the end of the day and how we can proceed. Thank you so much.
Nous allons procéder de manière méthodique. Il y a 3 rangées. Je ne voudrais pas faire de discrimination entre les rangées. Par rangée, nous allons prendre 3 questions. Quand vous prenez la parole, vous vous présentez pour que les autres membres vous connaissent. Ensuite, la parole sera redonnée au docteur Bruce et au docteur Dama pour pouvoir réagir. Nous allons commencer par la colonne La colonne de gauche. La colonne de gauche d'abord. Oui. Oui. Donnez votre nom, monsieur. Parlez, on vous écoute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still so back here that when the speaker was speaking, hearing the articulation, eloquence, I was wondering, was it Macron of France up there? Mr. Bruce, I think what he has spoken ties back exactly to why we're here. When I looked at the theme of the conference, the originating word said rethinking. Initially, I was saying, Lema is involved. We've been in regional integration all these years. What is he rethinking? I thought we were already cruising. But I think from the presentation, the truth is that really we need to rethink. The issue of national priority, national interest, and the regional interest and regional priority. Which one comes first, and which one should be leading the other? Because regional integration, the way we have taken it so far, one might even say that it was externally imposed. At a stage, it became the vogue, regional integration. Donors financing, when they come to you and say, yeah, if you have a project of regional integration, we're ready to finance it. So it really became, and everybody will keep moving forward. But where we are today, are we pursuing regional interest or national interest? And which one should lead the other? Because what we have experienced on the economic side in the field is that many countries have come together, agreed to regional priorities, regional agenda. But nationally, they have failed, or it is not in their interest to quickly jump on to implement those regional interests. He mentioned two examples of the issue of Côte d'Ivoire with respect to pharmaceuticals, and Nigeria that has come to ban 41 items. If you also look in East Africa here, you will see what has been happening between Ethiopia and Comesa in terms of when do you really implement the duty-free and so on. It's always, yes, we agree we're going to do it next year, which will never come. Then Tanzania of late has also stood up to wonder if they really open their doors as expected. Will it be in their national interest? So we are here to rethink, and I think we need to rethink. Because when we are allocating resources in the development context to countries, which is based on country performance, how good boy you are in terms of policies that are considered to be the best, regional integration, many of these our countries are penalized because they have not acceded or started implementing many of the regional integration programs they agreed to. We penalize them, even resources they could have got for national development, you deny them. So is regional integration really pushing them forward or pushing them down? But I think probably we might look closely and discuss what the presenter mentioned in terms of, have we been too ambitious on regional integration? Let's look at that closely. If we have been too ambitious, then we need to scale down to harmonize regional priorities with national priorities. And finally, like Adam said while discussing, we'll be doing the same thing the same way. We cannot expect different results. We've been doing this regional integration the same way. So what can we do differently? And we should also think in terms of the role of the political leadership. I know that this body is called African Economic Research Consulting, but I believe that increasingly we should try to accommodate politics within this our economics, maybe in the context of political economy. Because over and over again, politics seems to be overriding economics. And we need to see how we integrate both together. So in summary, what I'm saying is that let's use this opportunity not to take anything as given, but to rethink what we have been doing and see the way we can do it better. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention. Le deuxième intervenant, et puis nous passerons à la colonne suivante.
Thank you very much. Maurice Ekwang is my name. I'm a principal policy analyst in the office of the Prime Minister. Thank you so much, Mr. Bruce, for the presentation, and Dr. Adams, thank you very much for discussing the paper. My take are basically two. One, possibly the presenter need to say a thing or two other than the politics. The presenter needs to say a thing on the actual role of state in implementing the industrial policy or to facilitate industrialization. Experience have demonstrated from the success story of East Asia, recently in the contemporary economics we are talking of Ethiopia, we have seen how the state have come in very strongly to actually industrialize, not just provide enabling environment and leave it to the private sector to industrialize. The state actually folds its sleeves, gets its hand dirty in the process of industrializing. And truth be told, there's a success story to write home about some of those approach to industrialization. That's one. Two, the aspect of financing. In Ugandan case, we have a very, very unique situation. At the moment, the private sector is fighting with the government for money to borrow. They are all borrowing from the same source domestically. We finance about 2% of our national budget domestically with domestically borrowed money. And in a way, we are thinking that is crowding out the private sector into the money market. That's one. Then the second aspect to that is most of the lenders find it safer to lend to government for obvious reasons. In the market is equally worrying. Now we borrow to finance industrialization, which if you know it for a fact, probably you will start making money in 3-5 years. But you are borrowing short-term money to finance long-term development. And I thought it is a thinking that we might need to rethink. Kenya has gone an extra mile and said, look, we are not just going to allow the private lenders or creditors to charge whatever they want. We are going to slap a cap onto how much you can charge. Of course, now we are being told that they want to go back to rethink that approach as well. For our case here, the governor has put his foot down and said for him, if the government ever dares to cap credit to from private lenders, he's going to resign. He said, do it at the risk of me resigning. So the question of financing industrialization policy or strategy need to also be worked out at the regional level and at the national level. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Maurice. Le troisième intervenant, oui, Madame.
Yes, good morning. I'm Franny Leotier, and in this meeting, I'm in my capacity as Treasurer and Chair of the Finance and Risk Committee of the AERC. I wanted to make a few remarks, but perhaps to use the inspiration of the presentation that was just made and the remarks also by Dr. Mugume, and to use an example that is exciting Africans across the board, which is the movie Black Panther. So I have three principles I wanted to put on the table and get some reaction from the panelists. In Black Panther, when you look at Wakanda, Wakanda was successful because it could exploit a natural resource for shared value. They had very advanced technology because they could use that resource to advance the technology, but it was shared because the transportation and every other technology used was really for the benefit of the whole society. Secondly, they coordinated with other nations to face an external threat. So the regionalization came in through coordination to face an external threat. And third, they showed leadership to the rest of the world by offering what Wakanda uniquely had to be shared by the whole world. So the question I have for the panelists is, do you see areas where Africa can actually do that? Of course, this is fiction where we have superheroes who are political leaders, who are scientists and so on. But if you look in the African context, we do have unique resources, natural resources. We do have regional opportunities to face commonly external threats. And we do have unique value that we can offer to the world, whether it's ecosystems that are quite unique to the world and others. So perhaps you can comment on those if you see the Wakanda principles as a possibility for industrial policy and regional integration. Thank you.
Oui, merci, Madame, pour vos commentaires et les questions très, très constructives. Nous allons passer à la deuxième colonne. Oui.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Walia Ngandu. I'm the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Zambia. I would like to start by thanking both Dr. Bias and Dr. Mugume for underscoring the important link between industrialization and economic integration. I think our experience in implementing regional integration in Africa shows that when regional integration turns up alone without industrialization, it is defective. And it's pretty much like a man trying to walk on one leg. It doesn't work very well. But what I have is a more specific question for Dr. Bias. In your presentation, you did emphasize the need for harmonization and coordination between regional industrialization policy and national industrialization policy. Now, the key question is, which comes first? Which draws from the other? Is it national integration policies first, from which then the regional integration policy framework is best, or does the regional integration policy framework draw from the policy frameworks of the individual member states of that particular regional integration arrangement? And I think it's important that we understand which comes first, because, as you know, there's always this irritating issue around integration, which is the fact that some see themselves as winners, whereas others see themselves as losers. So I'd like very much to get your thoughts on which comes first. Thank you.
Oui, merci, Monsieur Waria, pour votre question très, très pertinente. Deuxième.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do share the position raised by the second and the third speakers of the first group.
Vous pouvez vous présenter, s'il vous plaît.
Ok. Merci bien, Monsieur le Président. Je m'appelle Boubacar Makalou, je suis le directeur du CERCAP, un think tank créé par le gouvernement du Mali que je dirige depuis plus de 10 ans. Okay, for language balance, please allow me to make my comments in French. Monsieur le Président, j'ai beaucoup apprécié les explications, les commentaires, les analyses des deux intervenants. Et je partage beaucoup de commentaires avec eux, sauf que par endroits, il y a des éléments auxquels je m'attendais que je n'ai pas retrouvés. Si vous prenez l'industrialisation, dans les développements et les analyses qui ont été faits par Dr. Bruce, il y a un élément que j'attendais, auquel je m'attendais beaucoup, c'est la question des capacités. Pour tous les acteurs, aussi bien les acteurs publics, les acteurs privés, que que les acteurs de la société civile. Je n'ai pas beaucoup retrouvé cette question de capacité de façon explicite et peut-être même de façon isolée. On aurait dû le ressortir pour dire en termes de capacité, qu'est-ce qu'on doit retrouver au niveau de l'État? Parce qu'à mon avis, ça manque beaucoup. Qu'est-ce qu'on doit retrouver au niveau des investisseurs, des opérateurs économiques, donc du secteur privé? Et qu'est-ce qu'on doit retrouver comme capacité, notamment en termes d'analyse et d'influence des politiques au sein des organisations de la société civile? Ceci me paraît extrêmement important parce que je pense qu'il y a des acteurs qui ne jouent pas pleinement leur rôle. Mais c'est peut-être dû au fait qu'au niveau de l'État, on a des insuffisances, soit dans la formulation des politiques, soit dans la mise en œuvre des politiques. Donc, à mon avis, il faut bien mettre en exergue cette question de capacité. Ensuite, à mon avis, il y a un élément important. Il faut peut-être fonder l'industrialisation sur un certain nombre de produits ou de ressources que nous avons à notre niveau. 1, les produits agricoles. 2, les ressources naturelles. Et, Monsieur le Président, puisque nous sommes là pour repenser l'industrialisation en Afrique, c'est le thème de notre séminaire. Alors, avec un peu de rétrospective, je me suis rendu compte qu'en 1954, quand on crée l'ancêtre de ce que nous appelons aujourd'hui l'Union africaine, qui s'appelait la communauté économique de l'acier et du charbon. Ça veut dire que cette communauté a été bâtie à l'origine sur des produits, notamment l'acier et le charbon. C'est ce qui a évolué pour donner aujourd'hui l'Union européenne. Mais pourquoi pas des communautés économiques chez nous fondées sur des produits? Le coton, le café, le pétrole, l'or, le diamant, etc. Je pense que puisque nous parlons de repenser l'intégration régionale africaine, il faut peut-être qu'on s'interroge sur ces questions-là. Que ça ne puisse pas marcher en Afrique, oui, mais cela doit être plutôt le résultat d'une analyse que nous devons mener de façon scientifique pour pouvoir dire oui, ça peut marcher chez nous, ce qui a marché ailleurs. Non, ça ne peut pas marcher chez nous, ce qui a marché ailleurs. Donc je pense que ça, c'est un certain nombre de réflexions auxquelles je me suis personnellement adonné. Je suis un passionné de l'industrialisation, c'est pourquoi j'ai écouté avec beaucoup d'attention ces développements. Merci bien, Monsieur le Président.
Merci beaucoup, M. Boubacar, pour vos préoccupations très pertinentes. M. Bruce, tout à l'heure, et Dr Adam vont réagir à vos interrogations. Troisième question.
Oui, ça marche. Donc moi, c'est Guissé Djalel, je suis directeur des études de la programmation donc, au ministère du Commerce et de l'Industrie en Mauritanie. Donc effectivement, j'ai trouvé une coïncidence, le fait de participer à cet atelier sur repenser l'intégration régionale au moment où effectivement l'Union africaine lance sa zone de libre-échange continentale. Dans la même période, ce qu'il faut dire effectivement, c'est que pour la plupart de nos pays qui sont en fait exportateurs des ressources naturelles, nous tirons notre croissance grâce à notre partenariat avec des pays hors de ce continent. Alors, si on décide effectivement de repenser à notre intégration régionale, je pense qu'il faudrait qu'à l'issue de cette réunion, qu'on puisse faire des propositions, notamment à l'Union africaine, qui est en fait le cheval de Troie de cette zone de libre-échange continentale, qui va permettre à l'Afrique de mieux en fait mettre en place cette intégration. Je pense que évidemment, en termes de compétitivité, la plupart de nos pays ne peuvent pas faire le poids par rapport, en tout cas, à ce qui est présenté actuellement, ne font pas du tout le poids par rapport à l'exploitation de leurs ressources naturelles, qui, donc, je le disais tout à l'heure, est la principale recette de leur matière, de leur entrée en devise, et qu'une fois que ce marché de l'Union africaine est mis en place, il faudrait aussi que ces pays puissent se mettre à niveau pour pouvoir mieux tirer les ressources naturelles qui leur sont dites. Donc c'est pour cela, je pense qu'il faut quand même qu'on dise que la plupart de ces pays, en fait la plupart de ces régions, l'intégration régionale, si je prends le cas de la Mauritanie qui est dans plusieurs organisations, l'Union du Maghreb arabe et actuellement aussi avec la CEDEAO, le constat qui est tiré, c'est que les entreprises ne sont pas compétitives pour déjà tirer profit de ces ressources naturelles. Alors, si on crée cette intégration régionale, est-ce en fait ne pas mettre la charrue devant les bœufs? Parce qu'on sait que la plupart de nos régions ne peuvent pas tirer avantage de ça. Et si nous créons aussi un marché commun, le problème ne va pas changer. Donc, ma question en fait essentielle par rapport en fait à ce thème, c'est qu'est-ce qu'en fait on nous propose à l'issue de ce thème, à l'issue en fait de cet atelier, pour permettre effectivement à ces régions d'être indépendantes. C'est en fait là que je voudrais que les deux orateurs puissent nous donner un peu plus d'explications. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Troisième colonne. Oui, docteur.
Bon, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je m'appelle Barthélemy Biao. Je suis de l'Université de Parakou au Bénin, laboratoire de recherche en économie et gestion. Donc, je ne vais pas renouveler ou répéter les remerciements et les félicitations aux membres du jury. J'allais dire aux intervenants. Mon intervention va porter sur 3 ou 4 points rapidement. Le premier, c'est l'intérêt de la question qui est à l'ordre du jour aujourd'hui. Pardon? Microphone?
No, what I meant was limit to 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll state my question after some statement. Donc, le premier, c'est l'intérêt de la question sur la triptyque industrialisation, intégration, développement. Parce que finalement, nos pays, qu'est-ce qu'ils recherchent? C'est le développement. Ils ont pensé que l'intégration régionale était une voie pour y parvenir. Et chemin faisant, ils pensent que dans la stratégie d'intégration régionale, l'industrialisation est un déterminant important. Cela se comprend parce qu'on a montré pour les pays développés aussi que l'industrialisation a été un déterminant de leur processus de progrès économique. Ça, c'est la première observation. Deuxième observation, il a reconnu l'Afrique a connu un recul en matière d'industrialisation. Il a parlé de désindustrialisation. C'est aussi une réalité. Maintenant, il faut réarmer et donc repenser l'intégration, c'est de voir comment l'industrialisation, on peut remonter et améliorer les conditions de l'intégration économique finalement. Quelles sont les leçons de l'expérience passée? 2 choses rapidement. Il y a eu 2 voies. Et bon, il s'est appesanti particulièrement sur l'expérience des pays d'Afrique australe. Mais en Afrique centrale, je me souviens dans mes lectures, dans les années 70, il y a une planification régionale de projets qui était le fondement de l'industrialisation dans le processus d'intégration de l'UDEAC. On avait dit, bon, si je me souviens bien, que la pétrochimie, ça devait être le Cameroun, je crois, ou bien l'industrie du bois, le Gabon, l'industrie de la pâte à papier, la RCA avait son industrie, etc. Mais ce projet qui existe, si vous allez voir les archives de l'UDEAC, n'a jamais connu un début d'exécution parce que chacun est allé ensuite dans sa direction. Donc, il y a la planification régionale, mais il y a aussi les incitations. Au plan régional, il y a eu des programmes, on peut dire des plans, on peut appeler ça des codes d'investissement. Et ces codes d'investissement au plan régional fournissaient des incitations pour l'investissement privé régional ou l'investissement direct étranger. Ces 2 voies ont existé. Donc, vous avez tenté, je crois, de tirer les leçons de cette expérience-là. Vous avez montré l'importance de l'économie politique et je crois que c'est maintenant que je voudrais vous poser ma première question. L'économie politique, c'est de voir comment les intérêts des uns et des autres peuvent déterminer la formulation des politiques et leur mise en œuvre. Est-ce que dans votre réponse tout à l'heure, vous pouvez faire une nouvelle synthèse, n'est-ce pas, de comment, dans le passé, les intérêts contradictoires au plan national, au plan régional et au plan international ont déterminé, je pourrais dire, l'échec des politiques mises en œuvre. Je prends un exemple, n'est-ce pas, pour exploiter l'aluminium de la Guinée, on prend la bauxite de la Guinée et on va la transformer ou le transformer au Cameroun. C'était la stratégie d'une multinationale qui investissait en Afrique. Bon, ça veut dire que les intérêts des multinationales et des pays étrangers constituent également un déterminant important des résultats que nous pouvons obtenir. C'était ma première question. La deuxième, et quelqu'un l'a évoqué un peu tout à l'heure, c'est compte tenu des objectifs de cette rencontre, qu'est-ce que nous pouvons retenir en termes de ce qui va se passer demain? J'ai retenu au moins une chose, en guise de rappel. Vous avez parlé des start-up au plan régional. Et effectivement, je crois, et si je prends AERC, AERC est un exemple d'intégration régionale par la connaissance ou par l'économie de la connaissance. Et donc, on peut bien trouver au plan régional des mécanismes pour promouvoir, n'est-ce pas, la jeunesse qui est dans l'entrepreneuriat, de manière à ce que ce soit le début d'un processus d'industrialisation régionale. Donc voilà, en plus de cela, peut-être que de façon plus précise et plus pointue, on pourrait avoir pour l'avenir des directions dans lesquelles il faut aller. Merci.
Oui, monsieur le gouverneur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My starting point also, like the colleague who spoke earlier, my name is Caleb Fundanga from Macroeconomic and Financial Management Institute in Zimbabwe. It was one of the regional integration tools. My starting point also is that when I came here, I expected that the rethink is because we think there are problems with the current model of integration. So I've been looking at, I listened to the presentation by Bruce and also the commentary by Adam. It's clear that this current system is not delivering. And there are questions about integration now. With Brexit, for instance, we have seen also the coming of Mr. President Trump and how he has trashed all the things that took a long time to do. Elsewhere, I do recognize that the West African, the Francophone currency monetary integration region is one of the oldest. Similarly, the Central African monetary integrations are also old. But there are now questions being asked whether these monetary integration schemes should remain the way they are or some countries should pull out. I think most of you have been following these discussions. And when you look at the growth, industrial growth that has taken place in Africa, can you attribute it to integration or it has just happened for those countries that are like? If you look at South Africa, South Africa has always wanted to remain in SADC and not favored joining the COMESA region, which is larger. But their goods are finding their way into all the countries in COMESA, even if they are not members of the integration scheme, which suggests that there must be something that can help countries to grow their industrial production other than integration. In fact, integration delays the process if there is no political commitment, as Adam clearly showed that even when you have agreed that let the best country export to the region, within themselves they start imposing certain roadblocks. We had a similar situation with Zimbabwe the other year. So it takes me back to looking at other successful schemes. And of course, the East Asian Tigers case is very clear. None of those countries conquered the world through integration. Small city-states like Singapore have become big. They didn't use a common currency in order to trade. If you got something people want to buy, they are going to buy. So what should we be concentrating on? I think infrastructure, certainly, we can cooperate to open up our markets. But we should be putting more emphasis on improving economic management. These cases where you can have a good policy on anti-corruption, but you get the worst case of corruption, those are not going to help our countries to move forward. So economic management is key towards ensuring that we can be able to produce things competitively. So competition also. All these successful countries, South Korea and so forth, they've produced goods competitively and gone on to conquer the world markets. So it is in this regard that I always think that if really our desire is to increase our share of the global market, economic integration may not be the best solution. In fact, even in economic theory, it comes at the theory of the second best. Because the best is to conquer the world. And I think Africa should start focusing on how, if you are a you should conquer the world to export your copper everywhere, or your cocoa, or whatever it is that you are doing. Not to start thinking that my sugar will only sell in Kenya, then you have lost it. I'll restrict my comments for the moment here. Thank you, Chair.
Merci, gouverneur, pour ces commentaires et recommandations très très importantes. J'espère que le secrétariat, l'AERC, en a pris bonne note. Oui, troisième question.
Very timely for me because I think regional integration has driven the industrial growth we have seen in Africa over the last year. We have a report here produced by ECA, African Development Bank, and African Union, assessing regional integration in Africa. Inter-Africa exports of manufactured goods represent more than 60% of Africa's exports. Inter-regional exports. So more than 60% of exports within Africa are in manufactured goods. But only 12% of our exports to the rest of the world are in manufactured goods. We have very detailed statistics here about the composition of inter-Africa trade and how it can boost industrialization in Africa. The evidence is there. So when we started 10 years ago to work with AU on rethinking industrialization in Africa. At that time, we were told by many economists in Africa and from outside Africa, be careful when you talk about industrial policy. I'm very glad that to see this meeting today, really, and the excellent presentation on industrial policy and regional integration. We identified 3 imperatives for Africa's industrialization. One is the need for development plans. We need comprehensive long-term development plans. Without these development plans, we will not be able to identify our national priorities, regional priorities, and find solutions for them. And therefore, I think Agenda 2063 of African Union, together with Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, should inform and be coordinated with national development plans of individual African countries to come up with national development plans and regional development plans that are coherent and speak to each other. So national development planning is an imperative. The second imperative is industrial policy. And the talk now is not about importance of industrial policy, but the nature of industrial policy. We don't want to continue industrial policies as Danny Roderick describes them as blueprints. We need dynamic industrial policies that are organic and that help us to identify our priorities, our niches, and that can be adjusted, but not the industrial policies that only bring African countries to compete among themselves and to race to the bottom. So then we have a number of reports on the nature of industrial policies produced by African Union and Economic Commission for Africa. The third imperative is regional integration. It is not a choice for us. If you think that regional integration is a choice for Africa's industrialization, then Africa will never industrialize. We live in a different world today, very competitive. We have opportunities to produce yogurt in Kenya and sell it in Uganda, but you cannot sell it in France. So the opportunities are there, and regional integration is a must. So we have challenges. Mr. Adam identified a number of examples, very good examples of challenges that we need to address. But we cannot talk about industrialization of Africa in the absence of regional integration. We know the reasons. Thank you.
Merci pour ces commentaires et recommandations. Ben, nous avons fait le tour des 9 questions, peut-être exceptionnellement la dernière question avant de redonner la parole aux panélistes. Oui, Présentez-vous, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je m'appelle Parfait Abouga. Je suis le chef de la cellule de la coopération technique au ministère du Travail et de la Sécurité sociale du Cameroun. Je crois que je vais m'adosser sur le précédent locuteur pour évoquer un peu les défis. Si tant est que la mondialisation est intervenue en Afrique et que l'Afrique est complètement dépendante des économies mondiales. En Côte d'Ivoire, j'avais déjà posé la question de la monnaie qui était un facteur limitant pour l'industrialisation, puisque dans certaines régions et pays africains, la monnaie elle nous est imposée. Donc, il y a les facteurs limitants. J'ai entendu beaucoup de personnes parler de l'Union africaine. La question serait de savoir que vaut l'Union africaine dans la conduite de l'intégration régionale et de l'industrialisation en Afrique. Est-ce que l'Union africaine est une institution forte pour conduire l'intégration régionale et l'industrialisation en Afrique? D'autres facteurs existent. David Easton parle de la logique du centre et de la périphérie. Alors on constate que l'Afrique, c'est la périphérie et l'Occident, c'est le centre, c'est-à-dire que les décisions nous sont pratiquement imposées. Vous avez les produits comme le cacao, quelqu'un a parlé d'un marché mondial de produits, mais la bourse, c'est à Londres. La Côte d'Ivoire, c'est le premier producteur de cacao. Alors, on se rend bien à l'évidence qu'il y a des défis, des facteurs limitants qui ne nous permettent pas, évidemment, d'aboutir à l'intégration régionale et à l'industrialisation en Afrique. Donc, vous avez d'autres facteurs, par exemple les multinationales qui opèrent dans le transport aérien. Vous allez vous rendre à l'évidence qu'en dépit des efforts de Kenya Airways et même de Ethiopian, il n'y a pas véritablement un transport aérien africain avéré. Les compagnies viennent d'ailleurs et prennent le marché, et donc il est difficile pour nous d'évoluer. Je vais un peu m'arrêter là parce que le temps nous est posé. Merci.
Merci, M. Bougain. Bon, avec votre permission, je vois encore plusieurs doigts qui se lèvent. Ben, avec votre permission, nous allons redonner la parole aux panélistes pour réagir aux préoccupations que vous avez exprimées, préoccupations importantes. Pour ce qui est des commentaires et recommandations, je pense que le professeur Lema, avec son équipe, en ont pris bonne note. On en tiendra compte dans le rapport de notre séminaire. Maintenant, pour ce qui est des questions qui s'adressent à Dr Bruce ou Dr Adam, je vais leur donner à tour de rôle la parole pour qu'ils puissent réagir et je voudrais recommander qu'ils regroupent les questions qui se retrouvent, qui reviennent. Dr Adam, pardon, Dr Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's a very rich set of comments and questions. I hadn't yet been compared to Emmanuel Macron, but I take it as a compliment, not as a... so now I'll try, I guess I've sort of noted 5 main things then I would sort of draw a bit from the questions that were made and try and sort of address those. But maybe the first question then that I want to just take up was this about what comes first, national or regional? And you mentioned sort of the need to harmonize policies, and in a way what I was trying to say was that the harmonizing policies almost is a distraction. I think the sort of planner's paradise kind of idea that, well, if we had the regional policy which actually fitted with the national policies, which fitted with the other ones, then everything would sort of flow nicely. And I think it's quite clear that in the past, whether it's been the idea that the regional policy, the national policies should align with the regional ones, or whether the regional one draws on the national one, what I was trying to highlight is that these need to be much more complementary. So I think there's almost been too much focus on harmonizing this regional and national level, and it's not about the policies almost. I mean, it made me think. There was some interesting work done by my PhD supervisor, actually, Sherman Robinson, who looked at trade flows around the world. So basically just looking at where have trade flows happened and when do you see trade blocks emerging. And basically through that work you could see blocks emerging before the trade agreement emerged. So you could see SADC beginning to form sort of in the 80s. So it provides sort of evidence that the private sector trade flows need to come first, essentially, and then sort of the blocks follow. That then still raises issues about what we're talking about here. And to my sense, what I've been trying to say here with bringing in the political economy angle is it's not by creating a regional goal that you'll manage to promote a national policy implementation. So what I'm suggesting is more turning it around and trying to understand what national goals, and national goals defined sort of in inverted commas, it almost needs to be sort of what things that concern the national sort of political elite, what concern them that could be supported by the regional process. And I think the point that was made by Dr. Mugume about sort of the NTB removal, when Kenyatta went and removed those and sort of said, okay, no more roadblocks. I mean, there were some losers from that move, so you had to go against some sort of political flack to do that. But in this case, was willing to do it because sort of I guess the political calculation had changed and said, actually, with the business interest in Kenya, with the stronger alignment with Uganda and Rwanda, there's less political concern now with those who are actually sort of gaining from the current roadblocks and things. So I think, in a way, the question is, what is it that leads leaders to take these kind of decisions, sort of Kenyatta and the NTBs? I mean, there are other questions. I briefly mentioned Tanzania and rice. I mean, one of the big issues around the rice sector in EAC has been Tanzania not fully implementing the common external tariff on rice because of political pressure coming from the Zanzibari rice traders. Now, is that something that can be addressed, or is that something you just have to live with? And in a way, what I'm trying to say is that some of these things, by taking a more political lens, you can begin to understand which ones are worth sort of confronting specific interests, and which ones are basically politically unfeasible to confront. And if we can do that, then you can start from this national perspective that might help understand where the regional traction is. And in a way, I mean, I can't answer the Black Panther question, but I like the way you framed it. But I think your point is that I haven't seen it yet, but they coordinated to face an external threat. And I think often here the point is that there's no such common unifying sort of external threat, which is why then it has to come back to these kind of national sort of interests and trying to understand where those actually overlap with the regional level. And I think there are some structural factors. So somebody started talking about sort of, natural resources in the coal and steel community. I mean, there are some structural factors where the fact that Uganda is producing, I mean, so the oil pipeline is a good one where the oil is in Uganda. You necessarily need to get that through one of the coastal countries. So there's necessarily going to be some sort of coordination and cooperation. So sort of, is there something you can build around those types of initiatives where there's a clear underlying need rather than sort of dreaming sky high? That then leads me to the third point, which is about capacities, that we didn't talk about capacity. I mean, to a certain extent, we did talk about capacity because, to me, the point that comes out of past studies is that where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, there's work going on even at the moment looking at Uganda and the fact of the oil negotiations. Is that it is possible within Uganda to create or to pull together the capacities that do exist. But it's more, again, a question of, is there the political interest to do that? Is there an actual genuine political concern to have a strong group, potentially autonomous from political pressures from elsewhere, that can then actually see some of these things through? And then maybe just the last point, the discussion of dynamic industrial policy. I think that, in a way, is the sort of beyond the politics. The second part, the second sort of key takeaway, I guess, would be this dynamic aspect of the need for things to be iterative. And I think it's interesting that Dr. Mugume mentioned this idea of car assembly. So you have three countries planning car assembly. On one hand, you could say, well, that should, of course, have been regionally coordinated, and you'd have liked to have an agreement amongst the three countries, sort of, you'll produce this, you'll produce that. But I think that's precisely the kind of thinking which has failed in the past. I mean, we're not in planned economies. And I think the sort of the market economy approach is that indeed one of these will succeed and the other ones won't. It sounds like you're saying already from the Ugandan side that the success hasn't been there. But this is also part of this idea of trying to be dynamic, that there needs to be an understanding of, if it's not working in Uganda, is it because there are certain specific policy barriers which are leading to that? or is it just it's not commercially feasible? So therefore, pull out of any kind of support there, allow the Kenyans to kind of focus on something else where there does seem to be something else. So it's again sort of coming back to my other final sort of punchline was about the ambitions. So linking this, the politics, the dynamism, sort of the iterative part and the ambitions, and I think hopefully that, at least in a way of thinking, helps to sort of see where there might be opportunities to sort of pick things out of the current very wide, broad regional strategies. Well, I obviously haven't covered everything, but hopefully, and we can discuss them here for the next 2 days, so I'm very happy to discuss more.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bruce. Now the floor is to Dr. Adama.
All right. Let me start with the movie. Is it Wakanda? I think it shows us what we have already talked about. You have opportunity, you have the leadership, and you have the cooperation. Where you see opportunity, you have the leadership, and you have the cooperation, I think it is always a success story. In the case in mind, in the case of East African Community, for example, when we are talking about oil in Uganda, when all the countries agreed to have a refinery and have a stake in the refinery, equity, in terms of equity, you will see that that is one of the cases where you can see that probably a refinery coming on board, each country has an equity stake in the refinery, and therefore oil being really used within the East African Community. I think that shows really that there is room for cooperation, opportunity, and also, but also the leadership. And I think that's what really the movie tells us. Again, in the same story about cooperation, etc., in the case of Uganda and East Africa, is the famous iron ore we are trying to do, iron ore melting. We have the iron ore, but to smelt it, you require either coal or gas. Initially, we are trying to get coal, I think, from Tanzania, but if we discover that actually it is cheaper to use the gas from Tanzania. So now the agreement is get the pipeline that will be taking oil through Tanzania to Tanga. On the side, you can have another pipeline that will bring the gas within Uganda to do the iron ore smelting. And that is also another question, where you have seen opportunity and where you have seen cooperation, and probably it can work. So there are cases where you can see that cooperation with leadership and having seen opportunity really do work. Now, I think we all agree here that regional integration in Africa is the way to go. There is no doubt about that. And also industrialization. The question is really how to go ahead implementing what our aspirations are. And I think really that's what we are discussing. And in my view, what has been missing is the idea of building state capacity to implement whatever we have agreed to undertake. The state capacity cutting across all spheres, from the political leadership up to the technical side. And I think really, once we can have that capacity to really to do what the states are supposed to do once they have agreed, I think we have a room to go in terms of industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. According to our agenda, the time is now over, but we may pick one or two quick questions before leaving. Yes, sir. You have the floor behind, please. Yeah. We need translation, please.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Dick Kamuganga. I'm from Uganda. I'm the president of Uganda National Farmers Federation. This is a body of smallholder farmers in the country. We have approximately 3 million members. And it's like probably having a fish appearing here among the senior policy makers as a farmer. But we have concerns that we were not able to understand, I think it is very good to aim at reflection. It's nice to do self-reflection. And the theme of this meeting is timely, rethinking regional integration. I wasn't able, probably it's because of my small understanding as a farmer, being able to understand why do we need to integrate? Why do we need to industrialize? By 2050 or by 2030, Africa in general, we will be 25% of the global population. And I am a post-independence generation kid. Our economies structurally have not been changing to accommodate the expansion of human beings around in terms of providing jobs. So my question is to the experts here, we are industrializing for what? In the farming sector, we would be industrializing for jobs, regionalizing for jobs. And then the first question came from the audience was national interest versus regional interest. Can we seek these goals of industrializing for jobs, regionalizing for jobs, have a national face or regional face? Is economies, when the good doctor from Bank of Uganda introduced his remarks, he said economies of scale are the advantages of regional integration. Can we make economies of scale national interests or regional interests? So those of you who are coming from different nations here, surely should we be focusing on national interests or should we be focusing, the same economist mentioned the shift from comparative trade at national level to trading tasks, to global to regional value chain, to value chains. Should we be focusing on these or interests of the citizens? Which are those? The households that have in Uganda here, I'm a Ugandan, as I said. In Uganda here, every household has a child that has finished school that is not employed. If it's not your daughter, it's your cousin. If it's not your son, and it's going to get worse by 2030, by 2050. So in rethinking regional integration, in rethinking industrialization, I think in the farming sector we are interested in these specific questions. Can we democratize industrialization? Is it still possible in the 21st century? The presenter from Europe, Macron, because I didn't get your name, I didn't touch. There is a scholar you usually read, Kenneth Rogoff, wrote a book at the end of the financial crisis and says, this time is different. And everybody who stood up quoted the industrialization of Asia, the new industrializing countries. Do we still have the luxury of the same set of policy tools in the 21st century to conform to the industrial policy? In other words, what new industrial policy set of prescriptions do we need in the 21st century? We know very well, those of you who are here in the farming sector, we still wake up at 5 a.m. after the cows have gone. We go to read on the internet on our phones. Artificial intelligence is on our doors. And artificial intelligence will go to the kitchens. Artificial intelligence will go to the farms. Are we able to deliver industrial policy that takes into the fact that the 21st century is different from the 19th and 20th century industrial policy, that takes into account the fact that even the farm jobs will be given to machines?
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I think being a farmer can be given a special consideration. I have one last question.
Be quick, please.
Among the policymakers, I have one last question. Yes. Non-industrial policy and regional integration forsakes the idea of human capital development. And if we don't discuss education, and we don't discuss restructuring education here, in which we have to develop the human capital that is necessary to enter into the 21st century job regional industrialization or whatever, I think we will still be at a loss at the end of this discussion. Well, Mr. Chairman, I can afford to leave at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, facilitators, and then I'm really happy about the presentation made before and also the comments made. Really, I'm rather confused in a way that we in Africa, we are interested in integration and making our policies to be one and to be, but the problem which I have is, do we want to unify our policy on industrialization and integration? Do we have a unified policy? And if we have, what is the interest? Is the interest is to have our market working together, or do we want to pull ourselves to develop on equal footing? And if so, how do we fund decentralization? Funding. Do we fund our industry on equal footing together? And where will we get the fund? Because sometimes the leaders may agree that we do this and do that. And then when we come to implementation, they don't do it all. Like the Malabo Declaration that 10% of every budget should go to agriculture. But unfortunately, I think none of the heads of the state has implemented and put 10% of its budget to agriculture. What will be the way out, really, if we want integration, to integrate together as a policy in Africa? Because in fact it is good to be together, and I would appreciate that all African countries come together and help themselves. Because not necessarily that African can be helped by people coming from our side. Because if we put, I have a belief, if we put our thinking together without being selfish with one another, because when we are coming together, we are not of equals. There are some countries which are more advanced than others. But are the countries which are advanced than others ready to pull the less advanced countries to come together on their equal so that they work together? If not, then what is the solution to such? Because it is good that we work together and we try to pull ourselves together. Another issue is what we produce, do we export it to other European countries and accepted by them, for example? Or it is we which consume from them? I don't know, actually. So I needed some clarification this issue of funding, and then also whether we are ready to pull ourselves together when we like to come together as people doing the same things. So I think these are some few questions. Thank you.
Honorable, aussi pour les commentaires et observations. Je vais repasser la parole au panéliste, Dr. Bruce, pour réagir rapidement avant que nous suspendions la séance. Dr. Bruce.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe it's quite good actually that our friend from the Farmers Association is questioning sort of what's the purpose of all this. Industrialization for what? Regional integration for what? And I guess this is part of the challenge, is that in theory then it's clear that sort of in Uganda if you don't produce inputs, you need access to inputs, and those access to inputs needs to come through better market integration. So in effect what we're saying is local market integration is important at the first level in order to get your goods to market and to get access to inputs, and this sort of the same thing just stands as you get larger at a larger and larger scale, except you have larger borders and barriers for cross-country trade, which then sort of pushes towards this regional integration. So the regional integration bit is about sort of access to markets, inputs, outputs, and we didn't really discuss it very much, but indeed the whole point of discussing industrialization is the ability to earn more income, create more value added per person, which therefore allows you to raise incomes rather than staying at a small scale. So I mean, maybe if you're talking about smallholder farmers, I think within that group there are sort of very different types of farmers, I guess, between those who are sort of potentially commercial success and could expand and begin actually to think about exporting into wider markets, but there are also those who are there somewhat out of necessity. And I think the point of thinking about industrialization is also the need to create jobs for those who essentially wouldn't be able to raise incomes just remaining as small-scale farmers. Maybe sometimes we take it for given that these things are important, but it's possibly still a good idea to question that. And to see sort of where different groups actually could stand to benefit, and what that then means for them in terms of this whole sort of policy discussion. I mean, and you talked about human capital, and where does that kind of fit in? And I think that also then fits into this discussion about sort of if we're talking about farmers, depending on the scale of their market, depending on the scale of their business, sort of the whole idea of promoting more investment is in order to allow people to use that capacity and to learn. And manufacturing is seen as one of the sectors where there's more of a possibility of learning and creating more sort of technology transfer. So I'm not sure if that answers your question particularly well. And I see we also sort of at the end, the Honourable Minister of Agriculture was also talking about sort of being quite confused. So maybe we didn't do a very good job in this presentation. But I think the point that you referred to at the end, which I think goes back to one of the larger discussions here, was about what about sort of the less advanced countries. And I think one of the sort of dichotomies in the whole regional integration discussion is between sort of these values of solidarity, and in a way this is a discussion in SADC as well, as South Africa sees the wider region as a region which also it has a responsibility for. But so then part of this discussion is reconciling sort of these values of sort of, let's say, solidarity and brotherhood with interests which then need to be driven ultimately by somebody. And for the public sector to try and push this, as we've discussed, then becomes very difficult. So we are essentially talking about sort of commercial interests and where those fit in. So it's sort of kind of trying to balance these solidarity interests with commercial interests, and they're sort of trying to get traction. So where is it that there's actually sort of ongoing trade interests? And in South Sudan, if we're talking about regional integration, then as a landlocked country, then again we're back to what I was saying before about sort of access to markets, access to inputs. It's a kind of structural necessity for not for everything, but for many parts for the economy to develop. But I guess this will be a recurring theme as we go on, so maybe I should stop there.
Ok, donc j'étais en train de remercier Dr Adam et Dr Bruce au nom de tous les participants pour la clarté de cet exposé, les commentaires qui ont été faits, et remercier en même temps les participations pour les recommandations qu'ils ont formulées, les recommandations de politique économique. L'AERC en prendra de plus grand compte. Merci beaucoup. Notre séance est levée.